The cards hit the felt with a sharp snap that silenced every breathing soul in the Lucky Dollar Saloon, and Beatrice Hawthorne knew she had made either the boldest move of her life or the most foolish. The year was 1878, and Deer Lodge, Montana was a town where women didn't play poker in smoke-filled saloons, let alone wager things that would make hardened miners blush. But desperation had a way of burning through propriety like whiskey through an empty stomach, and Beatrice was desperate indeed. She sat with her back straight as a railroad spike, her dark hair pinned in a severe bun that would have made her late mother proud, though nothing else about this moment would have. The 5 men around the table stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to poorly concealed amusement. The pot in the center had grown to $300, more money than she could hope to scrape together in 5 years of taking in laundry and mending clothes. Her father's debts didn't care about her circumstances. The banknote was due in 4 days, and if she couldn't pay, she'd lose the only home she had ever known. "You cannot be serious, Miss Hawthorne," said Walter Cunningham, the bank manager, his jowls quivering with indignation. He sat to her left, his cards held so tightly they bent at the corners. "I am perfectly serious," Beatrice replied, keeping her voice level despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "I call your 300, and I raise you my hand in marriage." The laughter that had started to bubble up from Jacob Moore, the blacksmith, died in his throat when he saw her face. She wasn't joking. The silence that followed pressed down on them like a physical weight. "That ain't proper," said Henry Walsh, the shopkeeper, though his eyes glittered with interest. "A woman can't wager herself like livestock." "And yet here I am doing exactly that," Beatrice said. She met each man's gaze in turn, daring them to challenge her further. "Unless you gentlemen are too timid to accept." That's when the cowboy spoke. He sat directly across from her, and she had been acutely aware of his presence since she'd walked into the saloon an hour ago. Maxwell Grant was his name, though most folks just called him Grant. He had ridden into Deer Lodge 3 weeks prior, trailing dust and mystery in equal measure. He kept to himself mostly, working odd jobs at the surrounding ranches, but he had a reputation for being fair and unflinchingly honest. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of creek water in summer, green-brown and impossible to read. "I call," he said simply, laying down his cards with careful precision. "Your bluff, Miss Hawthorne." The table erupted. Walter Cunningham threw his cards down in disgust. Henry Walsh demanded to see everyone's hands. Jacob Moore just sat there with his mouth hanging open like a landed trout. Beatrice's fingers trembled as she revealed her cards. A pair of 7s, nothing more. It had been a bluff, a desperate gamble that she could frighten them all into folding. She had been so certain that no decent man would call such a wager, that the sheer audacity of it would carry her through. Maxwell Grant showed his hand without ceremony. 3 queens. The room spun. Beatrice gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. This couldn't be happening. She had just wagered herself in marriage to a complete stranger, a drifter who might be gone by morning, and he had won. "Well," Grant said, his voice carrying a hint of something she couldn't quite identify. Amusement, anger. "Appears we have some talking to do, Miss Hawthorne." She wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to gather her skirts and flee into the night, to hide from the magnitude of what she'd just done. But Beatrice Hawthorne had been raised to face consequences, even ones as catastrophic as this. "I am a woman of my word, Mr. Grant," she said, surprised that her voice didn't shake. "When would you like to formalize the arrangement?" He studied her for a long moment, and she forced herself to meet his gaze. Up close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, marks from years of squinting into the sun. A small scar cut through his left eyebrow, white against tanned skin. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Pastor Williams keeps early hours. But tonight you go on home. Lock your door. Sleep in your own bed. We'll figure the rest out when we're both thinking clearer." The unexpected kindness in his words nearly undid her. She had expected gloating or worse demands. Instead, he was giving her one more night of freedom, one more night to be just Beatrice, unbeholden to anyone. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, collected his winnings from the pot, and pushed back from the table. As he stood, he paused. "Miss Hawthorne, don't run. I won fair and square, but I ain't the kind of man who would hunt you down. Just know that if you run, you'll still have those debts and you'll still lose your home. At least this way you have options." Then he was gone, his boots thudding against the wooden floor, the saloon doors swinging in his wake. Beatrice sat frozen for several seconds before the whispers started. The other players dispersed quickly, none of them quite willing to meet her eyes. She knew by morning the whole town would be talking. By noon, she'd be lucky if anyone spoke to her at all. Decent women didn't gamble, and they certainly didn't wager themselves like poker chips. The walk home felt longer than usual. Deer Lodge was a small town, nestled in a valley with mountains rising on all sides like protective walls. In summer, the air smelled of pine and wildflowers. Now, in late October, it carried the sharp bite of coming winter. Beatrice pulled her shawl tighter and walked faster. Her house sat at the edge of town, a modest structure her father had built with his own hands 20 years ago. He had been a good man, her father, but a poor judge of character and an even worse businessman. When he died 6 months ago, he'd left her alone with debts that would have crushed a stronger person. She had tried everything to raise the money, sold her mother's jewelry, took in every scrap of laundry and mending work she could find, skipped meals until her dresses hung loose on her frame. Nothing had been enough. Inside, the house felt empty and cold. She lit a lamp and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where her family had shared countless meals. Tomorrow, she would marry a stranger. The day after that, she supposed she would move into wherever he was staying, probably some rented room above the livery or in the boarding house. Her life as she knew it was over. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember everything she knew about Maxwell Grant. He had helped old Mrs. Peterson repair her fence without asking for payment. He always said please and thank you when he bought supplies at Walsh's store. He attended church on Sundays but sat in the back and left before anyone could corner him with questions. He had never been cruel or unkind, at least not that she had witnessed. But she didn't love him, didn't know him. And in a few hours, she would promise to honor and obey him for the rest of her life. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. Beatrice dressed in her best dress, a dark blue cotton that had been her mother's. Her hands shook as she pinned up her hair. In the mirror, her face looked pale, her brown eyes too large. She looked like a woman walking to her execution, not her wedding. Maxwell Grant was waiting outside the church when she arrived. He had cleaned up, she noticed. Fresh shaven, hair combed back, wearing what must have been his Sunday best, though the jacket had seen better days. He held his hat in his hands and turned it nervously. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "you came. I gave my word. So you did." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "Before we go in there, I need you to know something. I called your bluff last night because those other men were playing you for a fool. Cunningham had nothing but a pair of threes. Walsh folded with what I'd bet was a better hand than yours. They were going to let you lose everything while they walked away with your money. That didn't sit right with me." Beatrice blinked. "You knew I was bluffing, could see it in your eyes. Fear and hope mixed together, that's desperation, and desperation makes people reckless. He met her gaze squarely. I won't claim to be some kind of hero. I saw an opportunity and I took it. But I want you to know I won't mistreat you. You'll have your own bed if you want it. Your own space. We can figure out how this works as we go. Something tight in her chest loosened just slightly. Why would you want to marry someone you don't know? A shadow crossed his face. I have my reasons, same as you have yours. Maybe someday we'll trust each other enough to share them. He offered his arm. Shall we? Pastor Williams performed the ceremony in his small office rather than the church proper. No guests, no flowers, no music. Just the words that bound them together, for better or worse, until death parted them. Beatrice heard herself speak the vows as if from a great distance. Maxwell's voice was steady, certain. He slid a simple gold band onto her finger and she wondered distantly where he had gotten it on such short notice. You may kiss your bride, Pastor Williams said, smiling benevolently. Maxwell leaned in and pressed a chaste kiss to her cheek. Mrs. Grant, he murmured, Mrs. Grant. She was married. The reality hit her like a physical blow. They signed the papers, thanked the pastor, and walked out into the autumn sunlight as husband and wife. I have a room at the boarding house, Maxwell said, but that's not fit for a married couple. I've been saving my wages. Thought I might look into renting the old Peterson place now that she's moved in with her daughter. It has 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen. That sounds fine, Beatrice said, because what else could she say? Your house, though, your father's debts. How much time do we have? The payment is due in 3 days. $300, he nodded slowly. I won that much last night, it's yours. She stopped walking. What? The money I won, it's yours. That's why you made that wager, isn't it? To try to save your home. He pulled a folded bundle of bills from his jacket pocket. Take it, pay off the debt, keep your house. Tears burned her eyes. But then you would have nothing. You said you had been saving. I'll save again. Money comes and goes, but that house, that's your family's legacy. Your father built it. Your mother tended the garden. You shouldn't have to lose it because of bad luck and worse timing. Beatrice took the money with trembling hands. No one had shown her such kindness since her father died. The people of Deer Lodge had been sympathetic, certainly, but sympathy didn't pay debts or put food on the table. This man, this stranger she had just married, was giving her back the one thing she thought she'd lost forever. Thank you, she whispered. Maxwell, I don't know how to repay you. You already did. You married me, didn't you? He smiled, and it transformed his entire face, softening the hard edges reaching his eyes. Come on. Let's go tell Cunningham that you'll be keeping your property after all. I want to see his face. Walter Cunningham's face was indeed worth seeing. He sputtered and protested, claiming the money was ill-gotten from gambling, but the law was the law. Beatrice paid her father's debt in full, and Cunningham had to provide a receipt marking the account settled. As they left the bank, Beatrice felt lighter than she had in months. What now? She asked. Maxwell considered. Now I suppose we figure out how to be married. I'll move my things to your house if that suits you. I'll take the smaller bedroom. You keep your room. We'll work out the rest as we go. It was a strange arrangement, more business partnership than marriage, but Beatrice found herself grateful for it. That afternoon, Maxwell moved his few possessions into her father's old room. He owned remarkably little: 2 changes of clothes, a well-maintained rifle, a worn Bible, and a tin box he didn't open. He set everything in place with military precision, then joined her in the kitchen. Can you cook? He asked. Yes, can you? Trail food, mostly. Nothing fancy. I'll cook then. You can handle firewood and repairs. Fair trade. They fell into a rhythm over the following days that surprised Beatrice with its ease. Maxwell rose before dawn and tended to the animals, the small chicken coop, the vegetable garden that still had a few hardy greens. He fixed the loose board on the porch, patched a hole in the roof she hadn't even known was there, and oiled all the squeaky hinges. Beatrice cooked meals that actually filled their plates for the first time in months, using the grocery money Maxwell provided without question. They ate together at the kitchen table, conversation stilted at first but gradually growing more natural. She learned he had been born in Wyoming, that he'd learned to ride before he could properly walk, that he'd served as a scout for the Army for 2 years before deciding he'd seen enough of violence. He was 27, just as she'd guessed. He liked his coffee black and strong enough to strip paint. He read voraciously, anything he could get his hands on, though he'd had little formal schooling. He learned she was 22, that she'd been educated by her mother who'd been a schoolteacher back east, that she loved mathematics and kept a journal of the weather patterns. She preferred tea to coffee. She could recite long passages of poetry from memory. She had once dreamed of becoming a teacher herself, before life had narrowed her options. 2 weeks into their marriage, Maxwell came home with a puppy, a squirming bundle of brown and white fur that he deposited in her lap without ceremony. "Thought the house felt too quiet," he said. Beatrice stared at the puppy, then at him. "You bought a dog," found him, actually. "Someone abandoned him on the road. Figured he could use a home same as the rest of us." The puppy licked her face, and despite everything, Beatrice laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed since her father died, and the sound startled her. Maxwell grinned. "There it is," he said softly. "Was wondering what your laugh sounded like." She named the puppy Scout, and he became a constant presence, sleeping at the foot of her bed, following her around the house, greeting Maxwell with ecstatic joy every time he came through the door. The dog was a bridge between them, something they could both love without complication. Winter came to Deer Lodge with a vengeance. Snow piled high against the house, and temperatures dropped until the water in the basin froze overnight. Maxwell and Beatrice were trapped together inside for days at a time, and it was during those long, snowbound weeks that they truly began to know each other. He taught her to play poker properly, showing her how to read the tiny tells that gave away a bluff, how to calculate odds, when to fold and when to press. She taught him about literature, reading aloud from her small collection of books while he whittled by the fire, creating small wooden figures with remarkable skill. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside, Beatrice finally asked the question that had been nagging at her since their wedding day. "Why did you really marry me, Maxwell? You could have just given me the money. You didn't have to tie yourself to a stranger for life." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down the piece of wood he'd been working on and looked at her directly. "I was married before." Her name was Sarah. "We were young, maybe too young. I was 21, she was 19. We had a farm in Wyoming, small but ours. I thought we'd grow old there together." His voice was steady, but she could hear the pain underneath. "She died in childbirth. The baby, too. A son. That was 4 years ago. Maxwell, I'm so sorry. I left after that. Couldn't stand to be in that house on that land with all those memories. I've been drifting ever since. Working, saving, not really living. When I saw you in that saloon, making that crazy wager, I saw someone who was fighting to hold onto something. You reminded me that maybe I should stop running and try to build something again." He picked up his whittling again, not meeting her eyes. "Figured we could build something together, even if it's not what most folks would call a real marriage." Beatrice's heart ached for him. She understood loss, understood the way it could hollow you out and leave you going through the motions of life. "It could be real," she said quietly. "If we wanted it to be." He looked up sharply. "What are you saying? I'm saying that we're both damaged, both trying to find our way. Maybe we could try to find it together, not as business partners sharing a house, but as real husband and wife." She took a breath, gathering courage. "I care about you, Maxwell. I didn't expect to, but I do. Beatrice." He said her name like a prayer. "I don't want you to feel obligated. I don't. That's what I'm trying to tell you." She crossed the space between them, kneeling beside his chair. "When did you start becoming more than a stranger to me? I'm not sure. Maybe it was when you gave me the money without hesitation. Maybe it was when you brought Scout home. Maybe it was tonight, when you trusted me with your pain. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being afraid of this marriage and started being grateful for it." He cupped her face with one calloused hand, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "I'd like to try," he said, "to make this real, to be a proper husband to you if you'll have me. I'll have you." He kissed her then, not the chaste peck from their wedding day, but something real and deep and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he admitted. "Didn't think I deserved to." "We both deserve happiness, Maxwell. We've both paid enough for our share of sorrow." That night, he didn't sleep in the smaller bedroom. Beatrice welcomed him into hers, into her bed, into her heart. They made love slowly, tenderly, learning each other's bodies the way they had been learning each other's hearts. Afterward, she lay in his arms, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt truly safe for the first time since her father had died. The marriage they built over the following months was nothing like what she had imagined marriage would be, and everything she never knew she needed. Maxwell was patient and kind, quick to laugh and slow to anger. He brought her wildflowers in the spring, taught her to shoot so she could protect herself when he was away working, sat with her in comfortable silence while she read, and he worked on his endless whittling projects. Beatrice discovered she had a talent for managing money, and she began helping some of the other townspeople sort out their finances. It started small, just helping Mrs. Chen figure out why her grocery budget never stretched far enough, but word spread. Soon, she had a steady stream of clients who paid her in everything from fresh bread to actual currency. She saved every penny, determined that they would never be desperate again. Maxwell took a job as foreman at the Double R Ranch, the largest spread in the valley. The owner, Richard Reynolds, was getting too old to manage the day-to-day operations, and he recognized capability when he saw it. The job came with good wages and a percentage of the profits. For the first time in years, Maxwell was building something permanent, putting down roots. 1 year to the day after their wedding, Maxwell surprised her. She woke to find him already dressed, grinning like a boy with a secret. "Get up," he said. "We're going somewhere." "Where? You'll see." He drove them in a borrowed wagon to a piece of land about 2 miles from town, a beautiful stretch of valley with a creek running through it and mountains rising in the distance. A for sale sign was posted at the entrance. "What do you think?" Maxwell asked. "It's beautiful, but why are we here?" "Because I bought it, or rather we bought it, using both our savings combined." He helped her down from the wagon and walked her to a flat area near the creek. "Thought we could build a house here. A real house, one we designed together, big enough for a family." Beatrice's breath caught. They had never explicitly discussed children, though they'd certainly been trying for them. "A family, if we're blessed with one." He pulled her close. "I love you, Beatrice. I should have said it before now, but I was afraid of jinxing it, afraid of losing again. But life's too short for fear. I love you and I want to build a life with you, a real life. What do you say?" "I say yes. I say I love you too, more than I ever thought possible. I say let's build our house and our family and our future." She kissed him soundly. "When do we start?" They broke ground the following week. Maxwell did much of the heavy labor himself, but he hired help for the skilled work, and Beatrice was right there beside him, learning to hammer nails and saw boards. The house took shape slowly over the summer and fall of 1879, a sturdy two-story structure with 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. They moved in just before Christmas, their furniture sparse but sufficient. On Christmas morning, Beatrice gave Maxwell the news she'd been holding close for a week. They were going to have a baby. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing and crying at the same time. "Are you sure? The doctor confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to surprise you. Best Christmas present I've ever received." He set her down gently, his hand moving to her still flat stomach. "When? Late June, he thinks." Fear flickered across his face, and she knew he was remembering Sarah. She took his hand firmly. "I'm strong, Maxwell, and doctor. Morrison is the best for 300 miles. We're going to be fine. Promise me you'll be careful. No heavy lifting, no overworking yourself. I promise." He kept her to that promise religiously over the following months, taking over all the heavy chores and fretting if she so much as carried a full laundry basket. Beatrice found his protectiveness both endearing and occasionally frustrating, but she understood its source. He had lost everything once. He was terrified of losing it again. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Beatrice's stomach swelled, and the baby kicked vigorously enough that Maxwell could feel it from the outside. He would spend evenings with his hand on her belly, marveling at each movement, talking to the child about everything and nothing. On a hot day in late June 1880, Beatrice went into labor. Maxwell rode like hell to fetch the doctor, then paced the house like a caged animal while Dr. Morrison and his wife attended to Beatrice. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Beatrice thought she couldn't continue, but Maxwell's voice calling encouragement from the other room kept her going. Finally, at dawn, a baby's cry pierced the air. Dr. Morrison emerged with a tired smile. "You have a son, Mr. Grant, and your wife is doing just fine." Maxwell nearly collapsed with relief. He was allowed into the bedroom where Beatrice lay exhausted but glowing, holding a small bundle. She smiled up at him. "Meet your son." Maxwell took the baby with trembling hands, staring down at the tiny face with an expression of absolute wonder. "He's perfect. You're perfect. I love you both so much." They named him Matthew after Maxwell's father. He was a healthy, loud baby who seemed to have inherited his father's stubborn streak and his mother's sharp mind. Maxwell was a devoted father, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with Matthew during colicky nights, playing endless games of peek-a-boo. Life settled into a new rhythm. Maxwell continued working at the Double R Ranch, now with even more determination to provide for his growing family. Beatrice managed the household finances and continued her bookkeeping services from home, Matthew often sleeping in a basket nearby while she worked. When Matthew was 2, Beatrice became pregnant again. This time the fear was less acute, the joy more unrestrained. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1883, an easier birth that left Beatrice tired but triumphant. They named her Margaret after Beatrice's mother. The house that had seemed so large now felt perfectly sized, filled with the sounds of children's laughter, scout barking, and the daily organized chaos of family life. Maxwell built a swing in the big oak tree near the creek. Beatrice taught Matthew his letters while Margaret napped. They attended church as a family, hosted dinners for neighbors, became pillars of the community. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Maxwell took Beatrice back to the Lucky Dollar Saloon. It had changed hands and was now a more respectable establishment, serving meals along with drinks. They sat at the same table where they'd played that fateful hand of poker. "You regret it?" Maxwell asked. That night, that wager, Beatrice looked at her husband, the man who had started as a stranger and become her entire world. She thought about their children sleeping safely at home with Mrs. Chen watching them, about the house they'd built with their own hands, about the life they'd created from desperation and hope. "Not for a single second," she said. "It was the best bluff I ever made." He laughed. "Best call I ever made." They toasted with sarsaparilla, neither of them much for drinking, and Maxwell pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside was a delicate gold locket. "Open it." She did, finding a tiny photograph of their family on one side and an inscription on the other. "To my wife, my love, my everything, M.G. Maxwell, it's beautiful. Not as beautiful as you, not as beautiful as the life you've given me." He fastened it around her neck. "I was dead inside when I came to Deer Lodge, just going through the motions, waiting for my time to run out. Then you walked into that saloon and bet everything on a pair of sevens, and suddenly I had a reason to feel again. I was so scared that night. Scared of losing everything, scared of what I'd done, scared of you. And now I can't imagine being scared of you. You're my home, Maxwell Grant. Wherever you are, that's where I belong." They kissed across the table, ignoring the amused glances from other patrons. Let them look. Let them see what love looked like when it was built on honesty and trust and mutual respect. The years continued to unfold with the usual mixture of joy and sorrow that marked any life. Matthew grew tall and strong, already showing his father's way with horses by the time he was 6. Margaret was a whirlwind of energy and questions, keeping them all on their toes. They added to the family over the years, 2 more daughters born in 1885 and 1888, named Martha and Mary. The Double R Ranch prospered under Maxwell's management, and when Richard Reynolds died in 1890, his will revealed a surprise. He had left Maxwell a 20% stake in the ranch, making him a part owner. The income from that stake, combined with Beatrice's bookkeeping business, which had grown to include clients from 3 surrounding towns, meant they were financially secure in a way neither had ever imagined possible. They never forgot where they'd come from, though. When young widows or orphans faced hardship in Deer Lodge, the Grants were always there with a loan that didn't need to be repaid, a job on the ranch, a place at their table. They remembered what it was like to be desperate, and they made sure no one in their community had to face that desperation alone. Maxwell taught his son everything he knew about ranching, but he never pressured Matthew to follow in his footsteps. "Find what makes you happy," he told the boy. "That's all I want for you." Beatrice educated all her daughters at home, making sure they learned mathematics and literature, science and art. "You'll have choices," she told them. "More choices than I had. Use them wisely." On their 10th anniversary, they threw a party at their home. The house overflowed with friends and neighbors, with children running wild and adults sharing stories and laughter. At one point, Beatrice found Maxwell standing on the porch, looking out over the land they'd claimed and cultivated. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. "How lucky I am. How easily things could have gone differently." He squeezed her hand. "If I'd folded that night instead of calling, if you'd run instead of showing up at the church, if we'd both been too scared to try. But we didn't fold and I didn't run and we weren't too scared. We took a chance on each other. Best gamble of my life." Inside, their children were laughing. Scout was begging for table scraps despite being far too old for such shenanigans, and their friends were celebrating a marriage that had started as a poker game and became something beautiful. As winter settled over Montana again, the Grant household prepared for the holidays. Matthew, now 10, took his role as oldest sibling seriously, helping his father chop wood and making sure his younger sisters didn't get into too much mischief. Margaret, at 7, was already showing her mother's head for numbers and her father's stubborn determination. The two youngest girls, still small and sweet, believed in magic and possibility the way only small children could. On Christmas Eve, after the children were finally asleep, Maxwell and Beatrice sat by the fire, much as they had that first winter together. So much had changed, yet the fundamental truth of them remained the same. "You ever think about that night?" Beatrice asked. "Really think about it, I mean. How absolutely insane it was," Maxwell chuckled. "All the time. I think about how you walked into that saloon like you owned the place, even though I could see your hands shaking. I think about how brave you were, how desperate. I think about how close I came to not being there that night at all. Why were you there? You never said." "I was planning to leave Deer Lodge the next day, had my pay in my pocket, figured I'd ride south before the snow got too bad. Stopped in for one last drink, one last game. Then you showed up and changed everything." Beatrice turned to look at him fully. "You were going to leave, was going to keep drifting, yeah. Probably would have ended up in New Mexico or Arizona, working cattle, never settling down, never being happy." He pulled her close. "You saved me, Beatrice, every bit as much as I saved you. We saved each other," she corrected. "That's what love does." The fire crackled, scouts snored at their feet, and somewhere upstairs a child murmured in their sleep. This was life, Beatrice thought. Not perfect, not easy, but real and earned and precious. In the spring of 1891, opportunity knocked in an unexpected form. The territorial government was looking for someone to help establish bookkeeping standards for the various county offices. Beatrice's reputation had spread, and she was offered the position. It would mean travel, several weeks away from home, but the pay was exceptional and the prestige would cement her professional standing. "You should do it," Maxwell said when she hesitated. "I can manage the children. Mrs. Chen will help. This is your chance to do something important. But the girls are so young, and they have a father who loves them and can handle a few weeks on his own. Go, show them what Beatrice Grant can do." She took the job and spent 6 weeks traveling to various towns, setting up systems, training clerks, proving that a woman could do this work as well as any man. It was exhilarating and exhausting, and she missed her family desperately. But when she returned home to a house full of children who'd made a welcome home banner and a husband who'd clearly survived, but was very ready to hand back some of the childcare duties, she felt proud of what she'd accomplished. "How was it?" Maxwell asked after the children were in bed and they finally had a moment alone. "Wonderful, terrible. I'm so glad I did it, and I'm so glad to be home. That's how I feel every time I come back from a long cattle drive." He kissed her temple. "We're a good team, you and I. We support each other's dreams." "Always," she agreed. Matthew turned 13 in 1893, already tall enough to look his father in the eye. He'd discovered a love for books that rivaled his mother's, and he'd announced his intention to become a lawyer. Maxwell was proud, even if it meant his son wouldn't take over the ranch. "There's more to life than cattle," he told Beatrice. "The boy should follow his own path." Margaret, at 10, was already helping her mother with the bookkeeping, showing an aptitude that suggested she might take over the business someday. The younger girls were still young enough to be figuring themselves out, but they were growing up confident and curious, certain of their parents' love and support. On a warm summer evening in 1895, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Beatrice leaned her head on Maxwell's shoulder. 17 years, she said. Since that night. 17 years of waking up grateful. He kissed the top of her head. Think we'll make it to 50. I'm counting on it. Good. Because I plan to love you until my last breath and possibly beyond. That's the most romantic thing you've ever said. I'm getting better at this husband thing, she laughed. You were always good at it, you just didn't know it. They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Scout had passed away 2 years earlier, but they had a new dog now. A border collie named Ranger who was currently herding the chickens for no reason, except it was his nature. Inside the house, their children were doing homework, bickering good-naturedly, living the secure childhood that neither Beatrice nor Maxwell had fully enjoyed. They had broken the cycle of loss and hardship, had built something that would outlast them. "Tell me again," Beatrice said. "About calling my bluff." It had become a ritual between them, this retelling of their origin story. Maxwell obliged, his voice taking on the cadence of a well-worn tale. "You sat down at that table like you belonged there, even though every eye in the room said you didn't. You played careful at first, folding when you should, calling small bets. Then the pot got big and you went all in with nothing but nerve and a prayer. You said you'd wager your hand in marriage, and I thought you'd lost your mind." "I had," Beatrice interjected, as she always did. "But you were also brilliant. You were betting that no decent man would call such a wager. You almost had it right. They all would have folded except I wasn't decent. You were the most decent man there, maybe, but I also saw something I wanted, a brave woman who fought for what mattered. So I called, and you showed your pair of sevens, and I showed my 3 queens, and both our lives changed forever. Best hand you ever played. Only hand that mattered." They sat until full dark, reluctant to move, reluctant to break the spell of the moment. These times were becoming more precious as the children grew older, as life got busier and more complicated. They held onto them fiercely. The turn of the century came and went. Montana achieved statehood in 1889, and Deer Lodge continued to grow and prosper. The Grants grew older alongside it. Matthew left for university in 1898, studying law as he'd planned. He returned 3 years later with a degree and a wife, a smart young woman named Elizabeth who fit into the family as if she'd always been there. Margaret took over her mother's bookkeeping business in 1902, running it with the same combination of skill and compassion that Beatrice had modeled. She never married, declaring that she was perfectly happy with her work and her independence. Beatrice supported her completely, proud that her daughter had choices she herself had never had. The younger girls both married well, Martha to a doctor and Mary to a teacher, both men who treated them with respect and love. The Grant family expanded with grandchildren, the house once again filling with young voices and laughter. Maxwell retired from the ranch in 1905, turning over day-to-day operations to the next generation, but retaining his ownership stake. At 54, he was slowing down, his joints aching on cold mornings, his hair gone silver. But his eyes still lit up when Beatrice walked into a room, and he still reached for her hand whenever they sat together. Beatrice was 50 at the turn of the century, still sharp as ever, still beautiful in Maxwell's eyes. They had weathered storms together, literal and metaphorical. Droughts that threatened the ranch, illnesses that scared them, financial panics that tested their savings. Through it all, they had held onto each other and come through stronger. On their 30th anniversary in 1908, their children threw them a party at the ranch. Nearly 100 people attended, friends and family from all over Montana. There were speeches and toasts, stories and laughter, a cake so large it required 3 tables. At the end of the night, when everyone had gone home and they were alone in their bedroom, Maxwell pulled out a worn deck of cards. "One more hand?" he asked. "For old time's sake," Beatrice smiled. "What are we playing for?" Same thing we always play for. Everything. They played 5-card draw at the small table by the window, betting with buttons since neither of them cared about money anymore. Beatrice won the first hand, Maxwell the second. On the third hand, Beatrice laid down a pair of 7s. Maxwell laughed until tears ran down his face. "Are you serious?" Just reminiscing. She watched him lay down 3 queens, the same hand he'd held that night 30 years ago. Some things are worth repeating. Some things are worth building a whole life around. He stood and pulled her into his arms. "I love you, Beatrice Grant. I loved you when I called your bluff. I loved you when you walked into that church, and I love you now more than ever. I love you too. My husband, my partner, my best friend." They danced to music only they could hear, moving slowly in the lamplight, holding onto each other the way they'd held onto each other through 3 decades of life. The years continued their relentless march. Maxwell's health began to fail in his early 60s, his heart growing weaker despite the doctor's best efforts. Beatrice nursed him through each episode, refusing to leave his side. He hated being a burden, but she wouldn't hear of it. "You took care of me when I was desperate and alone," she said. "You think I won't do the same for you? I just wanted more time," he said one evening as they sat together on the porch. It was summer 1915, and he'd just turned 64. "More time with you. We've had 37 years, Maxwell. That's more than many people get. It's not enough." 100 years wouldn't be enough. She held his hand, this man who had been her salvation and her great love. "Then we'll make every day count. We'll squeeze every bit of joy out of the time we have left." And they did. Maxwell rallied through that summer and fall, spending time with his grandchildren, teaching the boys to ride and the girls to whittle. He made peace with his mortality, wrote letters to each of his children telling them how proud he was. He updated his will to make sure Beatrice would be secure, though she had plenty of her own money by then. On a cold November morning, he didn't wake up. Beatrice found him peaceful in his sleep, finally at rest. The grief threatened to swallow her whole. She had known it was coming, had tried to prepare, but nothing could have prepared her for the emptiness of a world without Maxwell Grant in it. The funeral was attended by hundreds. Maxwell had touched many lives with his quiet kindness and steadfast integrity. Beatrice stood dry-eyed through the service, supported by her children, and said goodbye to the love of her life. In the days after, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared so many meals and conversations. Margaret found her there one afternoon staring at nothing. "Mama, are you all right?" "I'm not sure," Beatrice admitted. "I don't know how to be without him. We were together longer than we were apart. He was half my life. He was a wonderful father and husband. You gave him so much happiness. He gave me everything, a home, a family, purpose, love." She touched the locket she still wore, the one Maxwell had given her 30 years ago. "I was so alone before him, so scared. He made me feel safe. You made him feel whole again. He told me once that he'd been just surviving before you, but you taught him how to live." Beatrice cried then, finally, great racking sobs that shook her entire body. Margaret held her, and together they mourned a man who deserved every year they'd been given and more. But Beatrice was strong, forged in the fires of hardship and loss long before Maxwell had come into her life. She grieved, deeply and truly, but she also continued. She spent time with her grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather. She maintained her bookkeeping work, finding solace in numbers and order. She walked the land they'd bought together, remembering the day he'd brought her there with such hope and excitement. 2 years after Maxwell's death, Beatrice was invited to speak at a women's business association in Helena. She told her story, including the poker game, the wager, The marriage that had started as desperation and become devotion. Young women listened with rapt attention as she explained how she'd built a career in bookkeeping when such things weren't done by women, how she'd balanced family and work, how she'd partnered with her husband rather than being subservient to him. Love is a gamble, she told them. Marriage is a gamble. Life itself is a gamble. But if you're smart about it, if you trust your instincts and bet on people who prove themselves worthy, the odds can be in your favor. I bet everything on a pair of sevens and a man called my bluff. It turned out to be the winning hand after all. She lived to the age of 73, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1926, surrounded by children and grandchildren who'd gathered to say goodbye. Her last words were reported to be, "Tell Maxwell I'll see him soon," though whether she was lucid or dreaming, no one could say. They buried her next to Maxwell on their land, overlooking the creek and the mountains. The headstone read, Beatrice Hawthorne Grant, 1853–1926. She bet everything and won it all. Years later, their great-grandchildren would play poker at family gatherings, using the same deck of cards that Maxwell had pulled out on their 30th anniversary. The story of the poker game, the wager, and the marriage that followed became family legend, told and retold, embellished and cherished. The house Beatrice and Maxwell built together stood for nearly a century before it was finally torn down, but by then it had sheltered 4 generations of Grants, each one raised with the values their ancestors had modeled: courage, integrity, the willingness to take calculated risks, and above all, the understanding that love was worth fighting for. In the end, Beatrice Hawthorne had walked into that saloon with nothing but desperation and a pair of sevens. She'd walked out as Beatrice Grant, and though she couldn't have known it then, she just made the bet that would define her life. Maxwell Grant had called her bluff, but in doing so, he'd given her truth. Truth of love, of partnership, of a life built on mutual respect and deep affection. It had started with cards on a felt table and ended with a legacy that would outlast them both. Not a bad return on a pair of sevens. Not bad at all. The Lucky Dollar Saloon, where it all began, eventually closed its doors in 1932, a victim of changing times and prohibition. But before it did, the owner had a brass plaque installed on the table where Beatrice and Maxwell had played that fateful game. It read, "On this spot in 1878, Beatrice Hawthorne wagered her hand in marriage on a pair of sevens. Maxwell Grant called with 3 queens. They lived happily ever after. True love is the only sure bet." Tourists and locals alike would come to see it, to sit at the table and imagine that moment when 2 desperate souls found each other through the shuffle of cards and the turn of fate. Some would place their hands on the felt and make wishes. Others would propose to their sweethearts at that very spot, hoping to capture some of the magic. The Grant family ranch, now run by Matthew's grandson, still prospered. The bookkeeping firm that Beatrice started and Margaret expanded still operated, now under the management of Mary's great-granddaughter. The family had spread across Montana and beyond, but they all knew where they came from. They all knew the story. Every year on the anniversary of that poker game, the family would gather, those who could make it, at the cemetery where Beatrice and Maxwell rested side by side. They'd share a meal, tell stories, play cards. The youngest generation would ask to hear the story again, even though they'd heard it 100 times. And someone, usually the oldest person present, would tell it. They'd talk about bravery and desperation, about a woman who refused to give up and a man who saw worth in a stranger. They'd talk about a marriage that started as a business arrangement and became a romance that lasted decades. They'd talk about children raised with love, about a legacy built on hard work and integrity. And they'd remember that sometimes the biggest gambles paid off in ways you could never anticipate. Sometimes calling a bluff was the start of everything good. Sometimes a pair of sevens and three queens were all you needed to build a dynasty. The wind would blow across the Montana plains, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, just as it had for generations. The creek would burble over rocks worn smooth by time. And in the gathering, someone would always raise a glass and offer the traditional family toast, the one that had been spoken at every significant Grant family event for over 100 years. To Beatrice and Maxwell. May we all be brave enough to bet on love and wise enough to call when we find it. And somewhere, in whatever realm souls went to after life, perhaps two spirits sat at an eternal poker table, playing hand after hand, winning and losing and not caring one bit because they were together. Perhaps Maxwell still marveled at Beatrice's courage, and perhaps she still laughed at how close she'd come to folding. Perhaps they looked down on the family they'd created and felt satisfied with the legacy they'd left. Or perhaps they were simply at peace, knowing they'd lived fully, loved deeply, and left the world a better place than they'd found it. That was, after all, the best anyone could hope for. And for two people who'd started with nothing but a poker game and a prayer, it was more than enough. It was everything. The story of Beatrice and Maxwell Grant passed into the realm of legend, but unlike most legends, this one was rooted in documented fact. The marriage certificate still existed, framed and hanging in the family ranch house. The brass plaque from the Lucky Dollar was rescued when the building was torn down and recited in the Montana Historical Society. Letters between Beatrice and her children, Maxwell's journals, bank records showing Beatrice's business transactions, all of it preserved and studied by historians interested in the real lives of frontier women and the men who supported them. But beyond the historical record, beyond the artifacts and documentation, the real legacy was in the people themselves. Every Grant who stood up for what was right, everyone who took a calculated risk on a dream, everyone who chose love over convenience, they were all echoing that moment in 1878 when their ancestor pushed all her chips to the center of the table and said, essentially, "I'm all in." Life was a gamble. Love was a gamble. But as Beatrice and Maxwell had proved, sometimes the best things came from being brave enough to play the hand you were dealt, and smart enough to know when someone else was holding cards worth calling for. Their story ended, as all stories must, but the ripples of that one night in a Montana saloon continued to spread, touching lives generations removed from the original event. And that, perhaps, was the greatest testament to what they'd built together. Not wealth, though they'd achieved that. Not fame, though their story was known. But family, love, and a legacy of courage that would endure as long as there were Grants to remember where they came from, and the incredible gamble that started it all. In the end, Beatrice Hawthorne had bet everything on nothing, and Maxwell Grant had called her on it. They'd both won more than they could have dreamed. And that was the real magic of their story, the part that made it worth telling again and again. Not the romance, though that was real. Not the drama, though that existed too. But the simple truth that sometimes when you're desperate and brave and a little bit crazy, you can change your entire life with one bold move. And sometimes, just sometimes, a stranger sitting across from you at a poker table might be the person you've been waiting for your whole life, even if you didn't know you were waiting. That was worth remembering. That was worth celebrating. That was the true legacy of Beatrice and Maxwell Grant, and it would endure long after the last person who'd known them personally had passed on. The sun set over Montana as it had for millennia, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere, a young couple sat on their porch, holding hands and planning their future. Somewhere, an old widower sat alone, remembering the love of his life and smiling through tears. Somewhere, a child was born, and somewhere else, someone took their last breath. Life continued, as it always did, in all its messy, beautiful, heartbreaking glory. And in one small corner of that vast tapestry, the story of two people who'd found each other against all odds continued to inspire, to comfort, to remind everyone who heard it that love, real love, was always worth the risk. Always.